Welcome back to the final video in the Supplier Approval Program series. I am Jamie Miller, Registered SQF Consultant at Kellerman Consulting. Kellerman Consulting releases weekly training videos and important tips and strategies to help companies keep up to date with the latest food safety regulations. In this series, we discussed how to implement and maintain a supplier approval program, what documentation is required, and how often to reassess these programs. For the final episode of this series, we will discuss supplier approval requirements in the major GFSI schemes, SQF, BRCGS, FSSC 22000, and PrimusGFS. GFSI is the acronym for the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is a private international organization that publishes benchmarking requirements for the food safety certification programs to adopt. Since all food safety programs must have basic controls over the safety of food or food packaging produced, each of the major GFSI schemes all require the highest standards for supplier approval programs. Facilities who are entering a certification or recertification audit require an up-to-date written supplier approval program, which includes policies and procedures for accepting suppliers, as well as an up-to-date supplier list must be in place, and an auditor can be expected to examine the documentation that has been assessed as part of the program to confirm that the facility's policies and procedures match the documentation available. The supplier approval programs we discussed previously offer all the same principles applied in the GFSI programs. Here, we want to focus on how to perform a supplier risk assessment and actions required where a higher risk is assigned. In our other video series, we have seen some significant differences between the schemes for culture of food safety, nonconformance, and CAPA and traceability. For supplier approval, these differences are smaller, but there are still some meaningful differences. The SQF Edition 9 requirements for supplier approval are found in the System Elements portion of the SQF Food Safety Code Manual in Section 2.3.4 for manufacturers. This is a mandatory section. In the Storage and Distribution book, it is 2.3.2 and not mandatory. The SQF practitioner and the backup practitioner are expected to have undergone food safety training through a HACCP training course, as well as a PCQI training course for FDA-regulated facilities. These courses qualify the practitioner to assess the safety of food, food packaging, and chemical suppliers, and to sign off on the approved supplier list each time it changes or during the annual program review. SQF programs must include contacts for each supplier and descriptions of the safety controls applied by the supplier to materials they provide. Suppliers with GFSI, ISO 9001, or GMP audit certificates may be classified as low risk as long as they supply the documentation required in the supplier approval program. Other required documents include allergen assessments, security assessments, and product specifications at a minimum. Brokers, agents, and co-manufacturers used by suppliers in the system must be clearly identified and should have a higher risk level than suppliers who manufacture their own products in most instances. For incoming materials, the SQF auditor will likely have the expectation of COA review, ingredient inspection for each incoming lot, or ingredient testing on incoming materials. For dietary supplement manufacturers, some amount of incoming testing is expected as part of the program, regardless of the risk assigned to suppliers. Lastly, the need to visit a supplier's facility is based on risk and applies mainly to high-risk suppliers that cannot supply documentation or where safety or quality issues have been observed with received shipments. Many SQF programs do not have the SQF practitioner or trained auditors visit on site, and is not a hard requirement, but should be considered on a case-by-case basis. The BRCGS Issue 8 requirements for traceability are found in Section 3.5.1. This clause is identified as a fundamental program, which means sites must have a fully developed and written program in place. Failure to have complete policies and records for supplier approval may result in automatic failure of the BRCGS audit. Like SQF, BRCGS auditors expect a risk-based assessment of supplier documentation for each supplier and each material supplied from those suppliers. Suppliers that are GFSI certified may be designated as low risk. ISO or third-party certificates should not be treated as equivalent to GFSI in a BRCGS program. Brokers and agents used in the system must be clearly identified and should be treated as high risk, as we mentioned for SQF. BRCGS generally elevates foreign material controls as a key safety measure, and all suppliers should have a detailed assessment of their foreign materials controls, such as metal detection, X-ray, optical sorting, filters, or membranes. GFSI certified suppliers may be considered to have sufficient foreign material controls because they have had their program audited to equivalent standards to BRCGS. But those who are not should provide a food safety plan or description that includes foreign object controls. The small differences between BRCGS and SQF for supplier approval is that BRCGS mandates that documents are updated regularly, at least every 3 years, and supplier on-site audits are expected. We recommend that BRCGS facilities budget the time and money to visit more than one supplier each year, including all suppliers identified as a high risk in the system. In the FSSC 22000 program, the Supplier Approval Program is found in the Technical Specification Manual 22002 and is considered a prerequisite program for food and food packaging safety. As with all the FSSC 22000 requirements for the other series we've done, the ISO requirements for supplier approval are determined by the facility. The facility determines the organizational structure of supplier approval and needs to document in writing the monitoring of suppliers, which should be in the form of a hazard analysis with chemical, physical, and biological hazard risks identified and assessed for each supplier. Since FSSC 22000 programs are based on the core pillar of communication, the Supplier Approval Program should include the risk levels based on the supplier's ability and willingness to respond to requests via email and phone calls. Suppliers that are responsive and capable of sending information quickly should be considered a lower risk than suppliers who are slow to respond or don't address documentation requests promptly. Additionally, suppliers that constantly change contacts or where multiple entities require contact to determine the correct person to communicate with, and even if they have a GFSI certificate, should be considered higher risk. The ISO 22002 Technical Specification Manual does not address supplier on-site visits, but we always recommend considering those as part of the supplier approval program. In the PrimusGFS requirements, supplier approval is addressed in Section 1.06.01 of Module 1. The Supply Chain Preventive Control Program is also covered in Module 7. PrimusGFS requirements are the closest to the FDA regulatory requirements found in the FSMA Regulation 21 CFR 117 Subpart G, discussed in Episode 3. At a minimum, an up-to-date written policy and procedure for the agricultural or warehouse operation, supplier approval list, including the controls for each supplier and materials received, should be on hand. This is similar to what we've mentioned for SQF, BRCGS, and FSSC 22000, but outdoor and indoor agricultural operations will generally have to spend more time and resources tracking down supplier information. Agricultural suppliers are often unable to supply the types of food safety documentation that food manufacturers and food packaging manufacturers can supply, so a higher risk for agricultural suppliers is often appropriate. Packhouses, produce brokers, and produce importers acting as suppliers should be treated as high risk unless they have a third-party certification that is up to date. Even where these businesses are well run and communicate well, produce is inherently more dangerous due to outdoor agricultural conditions, and packhouses, brokers, and agents generally have less control over the materials they traffic in. Farm visits and packhouse inspections are strongly recommended where possible. For all of the GFSI schemes I've spoken of, our viewers must take into account that our videos do not directly address all aspects of SQF, BRCGS, FSSC 22000, and PrimusGFS requirements for supplier approval. Please do not rely solely on our recommendations on this video, and make sure your program references and complies with the standards of the most current versions of the GFSI code your facility follows in preparation for your audit. To learn more, visit our website and you'll find a full library of food safety training videos and resources. Follow us on LinkedIn and click the bell to be notified of new resources as they are released each week.